So, putting on the heart of Christ. So, Gerald Fagin, who passed away 2012, 2 years after he put this book out, is a Jesuit. He looks a little bit like Benny, who's unfortunately not here, pero tiene parencia a Benny Diaz. He's a Jesuit. Tiene parencia. So he passed at 74 years of age, born in Dallas, Texas, one of 3 children. He outlived his entire family, siblings, and parents. He was the last of his immediate family to pass in 2012. He graduated Jesuit High School in Dallas in 56. That same year, he entered the Society of Jesus at St. Charles College in Grand Coteau, Louisiana, which we still use today. Many of our Jesuits here have been there. He got a master's in philosophy from Spring Hill College. It's a Jesuit college. He was ordained a priest. You'll see there in 1969, back in Dallas. He has received an MA in Divinity, an MA in Theology, licentiate in Sacred Theology up in Canada, at a place called Regis College, doctorate in Theology in Toronto at a place called St. Michael's College. So spent a lot of time studying, very well educated priest, solid priest from what I have read about him. His service post his education is exclusive to Loyola University in New Orleans. So once he received his PhD in theology, they brought him over to Loyola University, and there he taught, basically. He taught and was in ministry for the remainder of his priesthood, for the remainder of his life. Published a few books, as you see there. One of them was posthumous. Putting on the Heart of Christ came out in 2010. And you see there the various courses that he taught at Loyola. Had a great reputation as a minister, as a priest, as a professor, and also as a spiritual director. Marty? So as Marty was saying, Joseph Tetlow, who wrote the foreword of this book, also a Jesuit, spoke very highly of Father Fagin. I had a thought in my mind about Father Fagin. Oh, he was, in addition to the how would you say it other than extensive education, he was a spiritual director for 35 years. So he was not only in the classroom, but he was also in the confessional quite often and led numerous retreats. And the experience from those retreats and spiritual direction all fed into this particular book. So what is the book about? If I could summarize it in one sentence, it's practicing the spiritual exercises to develop the virtues. That's essentially what this book is about. And it covers 15 virtues. There's 16 chapters of the book. The first chapter is the intro. Every other chapter goes through a different virtue. So this is not a theology book. It's not a college textbook. It reads very easy, particularly if for us who are familiar with the spiritual exercises. It reads great. It's a great book, and there's a lot of really good insight in this book. And how is this book different from other books about spiritual exercises? So the way Father Fagin and the folks who do the introduction break it down is that a lot of books talk about how the spiritual exercises can be decisional in nature. And that's really one of the foundational reasons most people will go to the spiritual exercises. They want to make a decision, a big life decision, a life on their vocation. Am I called to religious life? Am I called to married life? I'm dating somebody, maybe I want to go do the spiritual exercise and see if this person is the right person for me. Or maybe I'm deciding between religious order and diocesan priesthood. Maybe I'm in a career change. Maybe I'm deciding a career. So I'm going to go to the spiritual exercise and have a big decision to make. Not an everyday decision. Not, what house should I buy? What car should I buy? But a big life decision. You go to the spiritual exercises for that. So a lot of books are written about that. A lot of books are also written about the relational purpose of the spiritual exercises, which most of us can also have experienced. We go because we want to deepen our spirituality, we want to deepen our understanding of ourselves, and we want to deepen our relationship with Jesus Christ. So we go for a relational purpose. This book talks to us about the transformative purpose of the spiritual exercises. How the spiritual exercises are meant to transform our lives, and it's not that these things are mutually exclusive. Right? It's not that decisional, relational, and transformative purposes of the spiritual exercises are mutually exclusive. They all go hand in hand. But this book focuses in particular on the transformative nature of the spiritual exercises, right? So if you do an analogy, and Ignatius talks about it, we exercise our physical bodies to get healthier. And if you want to lose 20 pounds, you go through a regimen of physical exercise and diet, you lose your 20 pounds. You've made maybe that was a decision and you decided to do that, and then you go on about your normal life. You don't necessarily transform your life to include a daily regimen of physical exercise or a diet. You just do 6 to 8 weeks, lose your 20 pounds, and go on with your life. Maybe a couple years later, you need to do it again. 6 to 8 weeks, lose 20 pounds, move on with your life, and you kind of repeat the cycle. What Father Fagin is saying, the transformative nature is you go through that very first experience of physical exercise, you lose your 20 pounds, and you change your life. You change your life to incorporate physical exercise, you change your life to incorporate a diet, and you don't have this cyclical nature. So the spiritual exercises need to be transformative in the sense that we incorporate virtues in our life so that our life transforms. And the way we view our life, the way we interact with the world, the way we interact with others, the way we see God, the way we see ourselves changes. Not once and for all time. As we know, we go to spiritual exercises at least once a year. That is what we try to do. And little by little, we change, we transform our lives to be more virtuous men. And that's what Father Fagin is trying to get at. The virtue. This is what we want to do. We want to transform our lives to become men of virtue. And why? Why that? But let's talk a little bit about what virtue is. And he spends a little bit about time talking here about virtuism. And we've spent a few weeks talking a little bit about philosophy and what philosophy is, substance, matter, form. And you'll see I'm going to go back a little bit to some philosophy here. We're going to go back to St. Thomas Aquinas. The stuff that has informed the Catholic Church for centuries. But what is a virtue? What do we want to transform our lives to be? St. Thomas Aquinas says the virtue is a good habit. And vices are basically bad habits, right? So an operative habit that is essentially good. Habitus operativus bonus. A good habit that is essentially good. That is a virtue. So a virtuous person is somebody that has cultivated good habits. A vicious person is not somebody who is vicious in the sense of like a dog attack is vicious, or a vicious bite from a shark, or a vicious beating. It's not necessarily what vicious, the root word of vicious really is. A vicious person is somebody who has cultivated bad habits. Because a vice are habits that are essentially bad. And virtues are habits that are essentially good. In that photo there is St. Thomas Aquinas, some other doctors of the church there to his right and left, Jerome, Augustine. Jerome is in red, Augustine next to him, Gregory, and Ambrosio, I believe. And just a wonderful painting there of St. Thomas, the angelic doctor. Operative habit. And that's a good key term that Father Fagin touches on, and we'll talk a little bit about that operative habit that is essentially good, or an operative habit that is essentially bad. Well, a little bit more about virtues, right? So we're looking for a habitual balance. And Aristotle talks about virtue, and for those of us who studied St. Thomas Aquinas, we know St. Thomas Aquinas valued greatly Aristotle, and in fact refers to him as the philosopher. And Aristotle talked about virtue as it being a balance, the mean between two extremes. And I have a list there of the capital virtues, as they've been called, or the capital sins, right? Two extremes and the virtues in the middle. So pride is the sin, self-loathing is the other extreme, humility is the virtue that's in the middle. See, greed, wastefulness, generosity, lust, prudishness, chastity. So it's in the middle. So these are good habits that sit in between two vices, two extremes. And there's two different kinds of virtue, and they lead to a rather interesting observation. There are restricted virtues, which pertain to the intellect. We won't go too far into the philosophy here, but restricted virtues pertain primarily to the intellect. Absolute virtues pertain to the will. Absolute virtues is what we're typically used to talking about. And we'll see what some of those absolute virtues are. Restricted virtues we don't really often refer to, but they lead to some interesting observations. So a restricted virtue retaining to the intellect, you could describe somebody, for instance, I'm a lawyer, you could say, I'm a smart lawyer. Smart is it's a virtue of the intellect, a restricted virtue. I'm a smart lawyer. I'm virtuous in that regard. But I may also be a greedy lawyer. So I may be a smart lawyer, but I may be a greedy lawyer. I may be an intelligent doctor, but I may be a prideful doctor. So these two things can play with each other. I can't be both a greedy and a generous lawyer. I can't be both a humble and a prideful doctor. But I can be smart on the one hand, but be very greedy on the other. So it's interesting play of how these are the two different types of virtues manifest themselves in our lives. And there's also divisions of virtues. The intellectual virtues, as we see there, wisdom, science, and understanding. The difference between wisdom and science is that wisdom studies the highest causes, and typically philosophy and metaphysics fall under wisdom. Science demonstrates conclusions through different classes of things, so very more limited: physics, math, chemistry, engineering. And then understanding is also a virtue. And understanding in the sense of intuition, not understanding in the sense of I've read a book and I understand it, so I'm virtuous, but understanding in the sense of the intuition. The other intellectual virtues are art and prudence. Art is the ability to produce external works that reflect truth, and then prudence is how do we proceed, right? We have a proceeding correctly, proceeding rightly would be the virtue of prudence. And then some moral virtues there, and the ones we're familiar with: justice, temperance, and fortitude. Justice is the ability to give each their due. Temperance is restraining ourselves from undue pleasure. Fortitude is the, if you will, courage to do what is right. So that's virtue, briefly. And the last thing I want to kind of cover about virtues are the cardinal virtues. Prudence falls in the category of the intellectual virtues. Justice, temperance, fortitude are in the moral virtues. They're called cardinal virtues, as many of us should know, is because the word cardinal, if you trace it back to its Latin root, means the hinge. The hinge, very much like the hinge of the door. All the weight of this door is borne by these three hinges. So the cardinal virtues are the four virtues upon which, and St. Thomas Aquinas teaches us this, and there may be some philosophers after him that change the cardinal virtues, but the way St. Thomas teaches is that these are the four cardinal virtues, and all these other virtues that are under them bear a relation, or as St. Thomas says, are annexed to the cardinal virtue. And you'll see here the virtue tree, and I'm not going to pretend to read what this exactly is, but this was used in the Middle Ages to sort of depict what the cardinal virtues and how they are corresponding to the other virtues down the line. I often confuse patience as a cardinal virtue, but it falls under fortitude. And humility sometimes gets confused as a cardinal virtue, but Thomas teaches that it falls under temperance. Temperance, again, being the ability to reject undue pleasure, to keep yourself away from undue pleasure. Chastity would fall under that as well. So that's sort of what the virtues are in a nutshell. And why does Father Fagin think these are so important in this particular time? And he says in his book, actually, that, and he wrote this in 2010, he said that there was an uptick, and I'd be interested to see what has happened in the last 8-9 years, that there was quite a bit of an uptick in the giving and the attendance of the spiritual exercises. A lot of interest. In fact, maybe it was around that time we saw a lot of interest in the spiritual exercises in the daily life. There's been a big increase to that. If you go on to Creighton University, they have a link for online ministries where you can do on your own or with a spouse spiritual exercises weekly. It's a 30-some week program, and you go there and you do these spiritual exercises. So there was an uptick, he says. And he says this, the virtues is how we live life in the secular world. It's how we respond to the hostility to religion that we encounter in our culture. And these are some examples that we have, and we have talked about some of this in some of the legal updates that we have done. One of the ones that I wanted to bring up in particular is, can religion set boundaries in child rearing? There was a recent case in Texas where there was a couple, they were married, got divorced, but while they were married, they had a child through IVF. But it wasn't the mother's egg, it was a donor egg, father's sperm. Wife at that time carried the baby. They got divorced. There was two boys. The donor egg was the second boy, was the donor child, was that issue. They get divorced. The younger child meets with the dad. When he's with the dad, he acts like a normal 7-year-old boy. When he's with the mom, he pretends to be a female called Luna. And the mom wants to put the child through therapy, where I forgot the term for it now, but put the child on hormones and start the gender therapy to change the child to become a woman as much as science will allow him to become a woman. And the father fought it in court. And I read briefly that the father lost in court. So the mother is allowed to, the way the article I read from LifeSite News, if you want to look it up, you can Google LifeSite News, transgender child, Texas. I'm sure this article will come up. And I trust LifeSite News. They're pretty good. So LifeSite News reported that the mother is basically able to force this child to go through transition. That's the word I'm looking for. Transition therapy. Hormone therapy and gene therapy, maybe even when he's old enough, sex reassignment surgery, a 7-year-old boy. So does a society allow religion to inform that decision? Or is religion kicked off to the side as some feel-good stuff, old, outdated language, stuff that doesn't inform who we are anymore? So this is the world we live in, and Father Fagin believes that the cultivation of virtue allows us to respond to this. Can religion inform my understanding of myself? Does religion have anything to say on how I identify as myself as a male or a female? We talked about the theology of the body. I was created male or female. Does religion inform that decision or not? Should it inform that decision or not? Cultivating the virtues help us respond, and it's important that the exercises are not intended to be a break from the world. And he points this out. The analogy is Olympians train hard. They spend 2 or 3 years training for what? For the Olympics. They don't spend 2 or 3 years training and then just hang up their gear and say, hey, look, I trained for the Olympics. I'm not even going to bother going. I trained, great, I'm done. Father Fagin says we don't go to the spiritual exercises to break from the world, spend a couple days away, get ourselves back in order, and then go back into the world as if the exercise never really happened. We go to the exercises to train ourselves to cultivate virtue, precisely to go into the secular world and witness to the world as men of virtue, to respond to some of these challenges as men of virtue, to respond to the materialism, the utilitarianism of the world with the virtues that we inculcate through the spiritual exercises. Because, why? It's not enough. Maybe that's not the right phrase. Jesus teaches us that we are called to more than just being a simple, nice person, a kind person, a person that accepts others, a person that says hello, a person that says thank you. We're called to be more than just nice and accepting. We're called to be people who transform, people who don't go a metanoia, people who live the life of Christ, who, as St. Paul says, takes on the mind of Christ. We're called to change. So Father Fagin says, inculcate the virtues for a particular reason. And he also relates this idea of virtue to the dichotomy, if you will, between being and doing. And Francisco talked a lot about being and the discovery of being and Parmenides and what being is and that all things are and the sheer power in the phrase of I am or it is. It's a powerful phrase. So in our world, we spend a lot of time, and I use the world briefly, that term with a grain of salt, if you will, but in our society, we spend a lot of time worrying about doing. What are we doing? What are we doing? How are you doing? What are you going to do? Well, how does you do make any sense? How does what you do make an impact in the world? What can I do with my life? We spend very little time talking about being and what it means to be and who you are as a person as opposed to what you do. And the famous question from Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question. And it really is the question. Really is the question that the spiritual exercises talks to us about. To be or not to be. Are you going to be Christ-like? Are you not going to be Christ-like? Because that's what Jesus says. It's either Christ-like or nothing else really matters. So these exercises, we're inculcating the virtues for this reason. They're preparing us to learn about who we are and to face the world. And this next slide may, strike a couple people as maybe not as accurate, but I like some of the phrases that are in this next slide. So many of us have heard that song, take Lord, receive all my liberty, my memory, understand. It's the Precipi prayer, if I'm not mistaken, attributed to St. Ignatius of Loyola. So it's not that the column on your left, the man who does, is wrong. And the column on the right, the man who is right. Right? Because there's a thin line between being and doing. Because who you are is often manifested and expressed in what you do. But it can never be the other way around. Who you are, it always comes first. And from that manifests what you do. Oftentimes what we do can mislead others. And in fact, the devil, the master of lies, works that way. What we do may not always reflect who we are. So who we are always must come first. So I work a lot with the S2V group and some of the young professionals. They're always worried about what is the key phrase there. What do I want to be? And those two terms don't go together. What do I want to be? A tree, for instance, has no decision to be anything other than what it is. A tall tree. Science can come up with the best soil decisions, the best climate, and manufacture the best mango seed and plant that mango seed. And that mango seed, based on science, has no decision to be anything other than what its climate and its genetics tell it to be. Zero decision. We do. We have that decision. So what we want to be is not really the question. What you want to do, sure. But who you want to be is the more important question. Who we want to be. Do we want to be men of virtue, or do we want to be men of vice, or do we want to get stuck somewhere in the middle and just be mediocre? Men who do see the law as a burden. Men who are understand the law as liberating. Men who do know the life of Christ. Men who are imitate the life of Christ. Men who do conform Christ to this world. I make my life, I'm comfortable, and then I bring Christ in, and I try to find as much as I can to conform Christ to my world and make it comfortable for me. Men who are conformed to Christ despite the comforts of the world. And Father Willie mentioned this, as I've said on Friday. The men who do search for Christ. We spend, the movie that comes to mind is the Tibetan movie by that actor. 7 Years in Tibet is the name of the movie. Spend all this time looking for Christ. But if you are Christ-like, you understand that God is looking for you. Like the prodigal son, he runs out looking for you. You allow Christ to find yourself. You're not just searching. You understand, if you do, you understand God's conditional love. If you are, you're actually moved by God's unconditional love. And instead of teaching rules, you do what St. Paul says, you preach Christ crucified. And interesting also, another quote here from Father Willie. He was talking a little bit about the resurrection, and when Lazarus dies and there's this colloquy between Jesus and Martha, Jesus tells Martha, I am the resurrection. He doesn't tell Martha, I will resurrect. You and I will resurrect, but Jesus is the resurrection. So Jesus is the person we follow. Catholicism is Jesus Christ. It's based on a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. It's not just about doing. Doing is important, but understanding who the person of Jesus Christ is and actually conforming your life to the person of Jesus Christ is what the spiritual exercises call us to do. And that's the true life of Christ. That's where we're called to be. So Father Fagin says that the issue of virtue and cultivating virtue should bring us to three questions. And he gets these three questions. He actually takes these from Alistair MacIntyre. I mentioned his book. It's called After Virtue. I have it if you guys want to peruse. A great little book. And Alistair MacIntyre ties in. It's really tied into what he talks about. Because Alistair MacIntyre says the Enlightenment Project failed. The Enlightenment Project tried to break away from Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and they tried to reinvent the wheel of virtue. And that's where we get a lot of our problems. We get a lot of the being and the doing and the dichotomy. And we lose the understanding of virtue. We get a utilitarian society for the most part. So he critiques that. So Alistair MacIntyre says there's three key questions. And these are three key questions Father Fagin says that we also encounter in the spiritual exercises. And I analogize them to the three questions around that cross right there. These are written in the sense of being, and the three questions back there on that cross are written in the sense of doing, right? But who am I? Who am I? And this is Socrates, by the way, who made this frame famous. Socrates says, know thyself, the unexamined life is not worth living. 2,000 plus years ago. Socrates understands the subject, the person, and how critical it is to know who you are. So who am I, and what have I done for Christ? Who ought I to be? And I have acquisition for transformation there for a reason, right? Who ought I to be is different from what ought I to do. What ought I to do can be expressed in terms of accomplishments. Well, what ought I to do? Well, that's usually measured by your achievements, right? Maybe you achieve a lot of knowledge, you achieve a lot of success at work, you have status, you have titles, you have wealth, you have power, fame, and legacy. What am I to do? So you have these. This is what you attain. And none of these is bad. This is just a little bit, just the difference between these two things. What ought I to be? Or what am I going to do for Christ? Or what am I doing for Christ? Is expressed in terms of virtue. Because instead of what ought I to do, which is in terms of acquisition, you acquire certain things that you have done, what ought I to become necessarily requires a transformation. If you're going to become something, you don't just acquire certain things. You have to transform who you are to become who you want to be. You have to be vulnerable before Christ. You have to allow Christ into your life, into your thoughts, into your desires, into your past, into your sins. And these things have to become transformed so you can be who you ought to be. And the spiritual exercise, St. Ignatius tells us we ought to be like Christ. That's a transformation. It's not an acquisition. You can't have two. You can't serve God and mammon. You can't be who you want to be and then also be Christ-like. That doesn't work out. Christ has to transform who you are, right? You die, like St. Paul says, and Christ lives in you. So it's transformative. And then how am I going to get there? What am I going to do for Christ? So it's either the path of the world, the path of vice, if you will, or the path of the cross, the path of virtue. So this is the invitation. And this is not feel-good poetry. We don't read this book to feel good about ourselves. Because Jesus says it's just not enough to smile, just not enough to follow the law, not enough to write beautiful things, not enough to give out money. Jesus wants you to transform. He says the rich man goes, Jesus, I follow the law, I've kept all the Jewish traditions, what can I do to be perfect? Sell everything and follow me. And the rich man can't do that. The rich man can't transform his life. Maybe he could do more. Maybe if Jesus would have said, listen, I want you to feed the poor every day on Saturday. Oh, I can do that, perfect. I can do more. But I'm not going to transform. What you're asking me to do, Jesus, is transform my life. I'm not going to do that. So Jesus says, yes, it's good that you follow the law. It's good that you do these things, but you need to do more. You need to transform. And the spiritual exercises invite us. That's the thing. Invite us into this transformation. So that's the introduction that Father Fagin gives us. The spiritual exercises have the purpose of decision-making, relational, or transformation. What are you transforming? You're transforming yourself in order to be a man of virtue, to inculcate virtue. What are virtues? Operative habits that are essentially good, contrasted to vice, which are operative habits that are essentially bad or evil. And we want to do this. The spiritual exercises call us to do this. Why? So we can engage the world. We don't want to be Catholics in the closet. We don't want to be Sunday Catholics. We don't want to be Catholics in our home. We need to be Catholics in the world. We need to be Catholics in the workplace. We need to be Catholics in the political arena. We need to be Catholics in our schools. We need to be Catholics on the street. So the spiritual exercises are transforming us for this reason, and they're challenging us. So I'm going to go into briefly now the chapter 1, which is the very first virtue, and that's the virtue of reverence. And I put up there the principle and foundation because there's no way to summarize the principle and foundation. I always read this stuff and find myself just aghast at the depth of what is here. The depth of what is here. The purpose of our life is to praise, reverence, and serve God. And to quote Father Valley, everything else is garbage. Everything else is garbage. I often hear young adults concerned. What am I going to do? They sort of agonize. I don't know what God wants for my life. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing in my life. I don't know where my career is. I'm agonizing over what I'm supposed to do. And St. Ignatius from the very beginning says it's this simple. Praise, reverence, and serve the Lord. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what you were created for. Everything else is attendant to these three things. That includes our job, our career choice, our salary, where we live, what car we drive, what group we belong to. That's all attendant to this. This is fundamental. This is the principle and foundation. We accept this first. And when we do, when we understand, it's almost, and I don't want to use the word simplicity, but there's just such a simplicity to this. Praise, reverence, and serve God. That's what my purpose is. And reverence here begins that discovery of God's love. And that's where Father Fagin goes in this particular chapter. That when the principal foundation calls us to reverence, to have that awe, to have that respect of the grandeur, the majesty of God, and the gift that is our life. You see, we are, and I'm going to go on to this, we are dependent creatures. And our world doesn't teach us that we are dependent creatures. Our world wants us to very much be, we are independent. Independent of authority, independent of our parents, independent of the societal structures. But in reality, we are dependent creatures. God keeps us in existence. Should he fail to think about us, we disappear. It's hard to believe, it's hard to grasp that. It's hard to grasp that in our society. Our faith very much teaches that if God were to cease to think about me, I would just disappear. Gone. Disappear. So we are very much dependent, but that dependency is very much out of love, an unconditional love. And this is key to understand reverence. This is an unconditional love we can't earn. We cannot earn it. This is key too. There's nothing we can do. Although there's nothing we can do to earn God's love. It's given to us freely and unconditionally. We only surrender and accept it. And that's a difficult thing to do, to surrender and accept God's love. It's difficult. But our actions, although they don't earn God's love, they do express that decision. By our actions, we express whether we've accepted God's love or whether we rejected God's love.
I was going to say this in the circle of philosophy, but now I say everything that God creates has to return to God. How things return to God? By man recognizing that God is the creator, by praising Him, by acknowledging Him.
Right,
That's how
acknowledge.
things go back to God. So man is necessary in creation to return the whole thing of creation back to God through knowledge, through praising, through awe.
Through awe, yeah. Acknowledgement and awe. Right. And that's that first, right? That's the principle of foundation. If we really meditate on that, of that simplicity of what we were created for.
I say this because sometimes we neglect the knowing of nature, for example. Is praising God.
Yeah.
You cannot help it to be surprised about the beauty of creation, the smartness, the things.
But that's one of the things Father Fagin talks about, is how nature exposes us to the grandeur and to the awe of God. Yes?
I skipped to another chapter, reference where you're saying what happens is that we take things for granted. And when we take things for granted, we don't see them as gifts.
Right.
And when we lose the sight that it's a gift, then it's that we possess that. It's mine. And because it's mine, then we tend to do whatever the heck we want with it.
Right.
But it is because we lose the sight of a gift.
And we lose the ability to express the reverence in our language. The world accepts us based on the condition of our utility. And the language can reflect that. How good of an employee are you? What do you bring to the company? What do you bring to this group? What do you bring to this family? Sometimes the way we talk to our kids reflects a language of utility and not a language of unconditional love. And that's really critical because you're framing the way that they see the world. Is it something that is unconditional and gift, or is it something that's utility? So that language is important, the language that we use, because it colors or it frames the understanding of the world. And going to what Mueller was saying about nature, G.K. Chesterton says, the world will never starve for want of wonders, right? Open your eyes, look around you, tons of wonders. But we will starve for want of wonder. So we will not starve for want of wonders, We will starve for want of wonder. We don't look at the world with the eyes of gift. We don't look at the world with the eyes of faith. We look at the world with the eyes of utility, consumerism. It is not there as that gift, that unconditional love. We don't revere the world. You know, St. Ignatius says all that stuff is there to help us praise God, to go back to God, as Francisco says. That's actually, that'll be one of the virtues that Father Fagin talks about as well. So from reverence, we go to gratitude. But that principle of faith, that initial encounter with the creation of God that leads you to that awe, to that wonder. And we have, I'm going to show a quick video here that I enjoy a lot. That it's not necessarily about creation, but we'll see here Abraham has that encounter of reverence. He falls to his knees. Moses in the burning bush takes his sandals off, covers his face. Idea of reverence. I'm before the holy. The Israelites can't look upon the face of God. St. Peter, which you'll see here, the disciples, when Jesus calms the storm, they're all in awe and wonder of Jesus' actions. And then the transfiguration, I don't know which one of the three disciples, they're like, oh, let us, we're going to build a house for you guys here. Or the blinding light. And Peter says, we're going to build a house for all you guys here. And there's this awe and this wonder. And here's St. Peter. This one gets me all the time. This is from the Bible series that was on the History Channel, the Bible miniseries. And it's a quick clip. It's Jesus and Peter in where Peter is fishing, and and Jesus tells him, throw your net over and watch the amount of fish you're going to get. Excuse the commentary, but I see Jesus is just sort of like watching Peter as he's in awe of the amount of fish he's bringing in, and look at Jesus' expression and Peter's expressions. Peter can't believe the amount of fish. And Jesus is sort of like, all right, you done yet, buddy?
How did this happen? What did you do?
I'm giving you the chance to change your life. Peter, come with me. Give up catching fish, and I will make you a fisher of men.
What are we gonna do?
Change the world.
So there's some, that's not exactly first word what Jesus says, but you see in Peter this awe of like, this man, how can he bring in all this fish? And now he's calling me to change the world. And there's also a dichotomy there of what Peter does to transform to be somebody else. You see, Peter was a fisherman, a good fisherman at that. There's no reason to believe Peter wasn't even a good Jew and had a good fishing business. He did good, but Jesus says, transform, change your life, and we will change the world. So there's this awe. When you encounter God, when you encounter the majesty of the creation, you're impelled, if you will, if you really encounter it with sensitivity, you're impelled to change. You want to change. And so all fascinating. We've talked a lot about this. The last piece I want to talk about here goes to what Eduardo was saying a little bit about. Is we live in a dispensable, fast-paced world. We have a hard time seeing the awe in the creation because we live in a dispensable world. iPhone 10, iPhone 11. Technology it's not that technology is bad. The nature of technology is that it's dispensable. Nobody here still operates a DOS system or has a Tandy 1000. Most of us probably don't even have a desktop anymore. How many people still have a landline, right? We don't do LAN. We live in a dispensable world, and certain things can be dispensable, and that's okay. But sometimes we're too quick to dispense with things. If it has a scratch, throw it away. Lease a car for 3 years, done. Next. Dispense with it. We lose the ability to understand the gift of creation. Our language even changes, and once our language changes, our encounter with the world changes. So it's a fast-paced, dispensable world, and living in that world makes it very difficult to practice the virtue of reverence. And this word acatamiento, used by Ignatius, doesn't really have a direct translation. But I read a little bit about it, and reverence can be, if you allow me to distinguish the two, reverence can be sort of a moment of awe. Right? And you may have various moments throughout your life, but maybe it's a moment of nature. Maybe it was for me watching that particular video. Maybe it's the moment of Mass. But if you've gone to a Tridentine Mass, maybe you experienced that reverence, that awe, the awesomeness. If you've gone to Yosemite National Park, or maybe it's a particular person. Maybe even with death. In death, you can experience the awe and you reverence the creation and the gift of life. And that could be a moment, and you can have various moments like that. But what St. Ignatius wants us to do, and the spiritual exercises calls us to do, is this acatamiento. This is the everyday reverence. Eduardo says, knocking the flowers and, stop screaming at me about how wonderful God is. Seeing it in your everyday interaction with people on a regular basis. Even the work, the mundane work, the silly work. Two quick movies. American Beauty, which I don't know if some of you guys have seen, but there's a scene in American Beauty, and it's a controversial film, but there's a scene in American Beauty where one of the actors, one of the characters, is filming a plastic bag blowing in the wind. And this guy has a bit of a colloquy with himself about the beauty of this plastic bag flowing in the wind, right? And to some of us, it could seem rather mundane and stupid and sort of dumb. But that acatamiento is the ability to see beauty in the smallest mundane little thing, to see God's providence in the smallest mundane little thing. That's acatamiento. That's the difference between those two. So it's a great book. Take a look at it. And this was the first virtue. So we'll pick up again in a couple of weeks. So any last comments or questions?
A couple of things. First of all, great guy.
Thank you.